We've been looking these last couple of weeks at what it means to be a guest. This all started for me in recognizing something profound that in Scripture I had missed entirely. You ever have that when you're reading the Bible and there's something that's been there this whole time and somehow you've missed it all of the time, every single time you read it? And this wasn't just a small thing. This was a big thing. It's like what I refer to as the big E on the eye chart. Like, this is something I should have seen. Even if I wasn't able to see the eye chart, I should have known there was an E there. Right? It's one of those things. And it was this idea that in all of Jesus' ministry, in His entire ministry, aside from two occasions, He always went as the guest and never as the host. Always as the guest of the world, the guest of the other, the guest of the Pharisee, the guest of the tax collector, the guest, always the guest. And the idea that the reason this is so profound in my heart and in my mind is because so much of what we've done as a church is to structure our life together as the host. It's always the host. We're always the host. And here's the big idea. It's this idea that the host kind of is in charge. We can honor and respect the guest and take good care and make them feel like they're guests of honor. But when push comes to shove, it's the host that is in charge. It's the host that has the control, and the guest is always the lesser person. Yet the ministry of Christ was the exact opposite. He who was in the very form of God did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. But He emptied Himself, and He took on the form of a servant. And finding Himself in the form of a servant, He became obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, all of Jesus' ministry was as a guest, to the point that the thing that characterizes humanity the most, our death, He bore all of. The weakness of Christ's ministry was in the fact that He came abiding by our rules to the point of death. And I thought, man, we've missed something in the church. I've missed something in the church. And hear me on this. I try to keep being very, very clear on this. I am telling you, you need to keep inviting people to church. Okay? So that this does not renege any of your responsibilities in this or my responsibilities in this. But it's this idea that our ministry does not begin and end in the church, that the church's ministry is not to the church. The church's ministry is to the world. The church is the body of Christ, and Christ came into the world as a guest. And this has devastated my life in a good way, because I've realized how much of my own life needs restructured to get this concept in mind. And honestly, going as the guest is terrifying, isn't it? It's especially... We have ways of isolating ourselves so that we don't have to do this. One of the primary ways because it is scary, one of the primary ways of us separating ourselves is through umbrella-shaped ideas about other people. Right? You see a behavior in one person and you assign that behavior to the whole group of people. So you see, for instance, a preacher behaving badly. One, for instance, hypothetically. You say a preacher behaving badly, and you assume that all preachers behave badly. Right? That's what we do. We do this sometimes. We might call them stereotypes. That word maybe is sometimes overused recently. But sometimes the best way of keeping ourselves from being part of the other is by assigning categories to groups of people rather than knowing the person. You see, the individual might change your perspective on the group, But we'll assume the group mentality, and it's easier to look at the group without ever knowing the person, and we can keep a safe distance. Morality from a distance is easy. It's very easy until it's your kid, until it's your neighbor, until it's your friend. And I experienced this not too long ago, very unintentionally, and then I got a kick out of it, and so I did it intentionally. Let me explain to you what happened. I had gone to a store, and they were doing a clearance. I always shop clearance. I never shop the middle of the store. I always shop the outside of the store, and it works well because clearance for me is in the boys department, which means I can get things for nothing. And so I was getting some clothes. They had some T-shirts on sale. They were like $1.50. I didn't even care. T-shirts. I mean, they're T-shirts. I just went to the clearance rack and went into the cart. Just bought a bunch of T-shirts. Like, who doesn't need T-shirts? And so I bought a bunch of T-shirts, and I prefer the darker colored ones. You know, I'm a little too small and cute to be wearing pastels. And so I kept wearing this black T-shirt. Weeks I was wearing this T-shirt. And finally, I come out wearing this T-shirt, and my wife says, "What are you wearing?" I'd never paid attention. But what it had on the front of it was this picture of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Okay, no problem. And a bright pink triangle around it. Some of you are like, "Oh, man." Okay, so this was a shirt with a message that I was proudly wearing. I did not know. So then I became aware of that, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if now that I know what I've got on, if I was able to measure people's responses? So most people didn't pay attention, admittedly. But I remember once I was in Walmart, which I go to Walmart just in case there is purgatory, because me going to Walmart is time out of purgatory later. So I was in Walmart, and I was coming down the aisle, and at the end of the aisle there was this gal pushing her cart, and there was this gal in a bright yellow T-shirt, and she was a Christian. I knew this because her T-shirt had this baby chicken on the front of her T-shirt, and in bright red letters it said "Jesus Chick." Now let's be honest, that is a garish, horrible T-shirt, right? It's just like, ugh, what threw up on your shirt? You know, this is the type of shirt that Tammy Faye would have worn. It just was not, it was just not the prettiest T-shirt. But it clearly identified where she was, and my shirt, at least she thought, clearly identified where I was. So we come down the aisle from opposite points, and I saw her. She saw me. I saw her shirt. She saw my shirt, and she went to the next aisle. Turned around, did a 180-degree turn, and went to the next aisle. I thought, oh no, this is a fluke. That is not the way Christians act. So I went to the next aisle. And we repeated the ritual from the previous aisle. And she left. I felt ostracized. I felt condemned. I felt dirty. I felt all of those things. And all of a sudden I had empathy, where I didn't have empathy before, because I had seen a group, not a person. It's a little odd when you're the person. This is what it means to be a guest in the life of the world. Maybe we need to, as the old adage says, walk in another's moccasins for a mile. Maybe we need to get on the dirt and in the ground level for a minute. This is what God did. This is what the incarnation was. There is a quote that has kind of shaped the way I've been thinking these last few weeks. Here's what the incarnation is. The incarnation, Christ coming in the flesh, is God dressing Himself for the work of salvation. God clothing Himself so that He can identify with us, so that He can be about the work that we need done. but He clothes Himself in flesh. He becomes the guest of humanity. And this is the concept. We see these images. We think the guests at the table are the ones that we're inviting. And what I'm saying is we've got it exactly wrong. That the world is pulling out a chair waiting for the church to sit in it. Waiting for us to pull up to their table. Waiting for us to hear their stories. Waiting for us to fellowship with them. And the church instead is spending all of its time waiting for them to fellowship with us. And guess what never happens? Fellowship. So here's the phrases I've wanted you to remember. Each week we've gone through this. Communion of one is isolation. It is not communion at all. Notice the Eucharistic elements, the meal of thanksgiving. That's what Eucharist means. It means thanksgiving. When we eat the Eucharistic meal, we are eating the thanksgiving of Christ. It becomes a thank offering for us. But notice, where there is one, there is no communion, period. It's isolation. Where a communion of saints is fellowship. I love fellowship. We're going to fellowship today after the service in the fellowship hall, right? This isn't an accident. Fellowship is good. It's necessary. It's part of the life of the church. I'm not preaching against fellowship, but the reality is that if we're all the same, it is just fellowship. It's nothing more. But here's where it begins to become a little harder for us. A communion of others is community. This is precisely what the New Testament is about. I dare say all of Scripture. The New Testament in particular, though, is written, Paul's letters and James and Hebrews, whoever wrote that, and 1st and 2nd Timothy, and all of these letters together are written to the church in a way that is to teach the church how a bunch of people that are not the same can get along together. The whole New Testament is about Christians getting along. Think about this. The book of Philemon is talking about a slave owner and a slave. One's a runaway, but both are, Paul says, are brothers in Christ. Here's what would happen in the first century, is all would come into the gathering, and especially around the table, especially around the memorial feast of the Lord, the Eucharistic meal, there would be no differentiation. So the slave owner and the slave are brothers and they're equals. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine where there is no parsing of people? Can you imagine where there is no differentiation? It's not that we're not different. Right? My kid brother was with us last week, my smaller sister. Wow. Congratulations. That's a doing in and of itself. My younger sister is with us this week, but we're not saying that we don't recognize differences. I don't know if you noticed, but there was a conversation that happened, and one of the parents pointed out to their kid and said, that's Jeff's brother. And the response was, well, he's tall. Wait. He's black, right? He knows. It's not a secret. We told him years ago. Okay. So when I say gathering around the table as differences, undifferentiated, I'm not saying that we lose the diversity that makes us who we are. In fact, that's the miracle of the table, is that we are so diverse, yet we are united under one head. That's what makes this amazing. So here's the idea, is the communion of others is community, and then finally this, and this is the most exciting to me, community of all is salvation. For God so loved the world, not some, not just the few that He elected to love, He elected the whole world. That anyone in the world that believes in Him will be saved. This is the goal, this is the hope, this is the ambition of the gospel message. And so here we come to the message, the story for this day. We've been looking in the book of Luke at those moments when Jesus was invited as a guest into others' homes. And this week we're going to look at Jesus going to the home of a Pharisee. I want to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 11. We're going to be picking up the story with verse 37, and I want to read it to you as we get into this. Luke chapter 11, beginning with verse 37. I'm reading today from the ESV. Hopefully you can follow along. I'm working with a new translation, the CEB, the Common English Bible, which I'm really kind of digging. And so we'll see. It may make it into the sermon in a few weeks. But I'm still reading this morning from the ESV. Here's what it says, Luke chapter 11, beginning with verse 37. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and reclined at the table. Pause here for just a second. You've got to see, this is one of those rare instances when I don't think Jesus is being set up, and I don't think Jesus is looking for a fight. I think there was a desire for genuine fellowship. But even in the best of situations, things sometimes go south at dinner. I thought that's a good warning getting into the holidays and as family gatherings unfold, that sometimes even dysfunction occurred in Jesus' setting. So anyway, while Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and he reclined at the table. They didn't sit, they reclined. Verse 38, the Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. Sorry, some of you are from like Illinois where I am, so I'm going to translate for you. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, it's the gift of tongues I've got. And the Lord said to him, now you Pharisees, cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You fools. Remember, Jesus is the guest. You fools! Did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. But woe to you Pharisees! For you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Let me pause there for just a second, because this is not what the sermon is about. But this is where the New Testament says it's a good thing to tithe. It is a good thing. You're like, well, the New Testament doesn't say anything about tithe. Yep, it does, right there. He says, do not neglect doing these things while you're doing these other things. Now, for the record, we're not looking for mint and rue and cloves. But whatever, you give to God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you Pharisees, verse 43, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it. One of the lawyers answered him, Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also. Lawyer, teacher of the law, scribe. These were the ones controlling how information was disseminated. They were kind of interpreters of Scripture. The Pharisees were the conveyors. They kind of acted out what God's law said, but these were the ones who interpreted the law. And he said, you insult us also. And he said, woe to you lawyers also. For you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. You don't even lift a finger to help out. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses and consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore, also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, from A to Z, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not, and you did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering. As he went away from there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him, to speak about many things, lying in wait for him, to catch him in something that he might say. Wow. Isn't that quite a story? This is how Jesus sometimes comes as a guest into our lives. Here's what I want to begin with. I want you to understand the concept of the Pharisee and the concept of hand washing. It's going to shape how we understand this passage. Understand, first of all, that a Pharisee was not a priest, not a pastor, not a preacher. The Pharisees were leaders in the church, but it was a lay-led movement. Let me give you an example. All priests were Levites, right? From the tribe of Levi. All priests were Levites. Not all Levites were priests. It was a big tribe. Well, it wasn't that big, but it was big enough that if they were all priests, we'd have more preachers than people, right? And so all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. But only Levites were priests. Do you remember Paul going through his credentials? He says, I was trained as a Pharisee in regards to the law, blameless, and then he said, I was a Benjamite of the tribe of Benjamin. Paul wasn't a priest. He was a Pharisee. You see, the Pharisees were a lay-led movement. And here was what the Pharisees were doing. They actually had good intentions. We lose this sometimes in reading our scriptures because Jesus, the writers of the Gospels were writing to a generation that admired the Pharisees. And so they wrote in a harsh voice. Now, after 2,000 years of reading the harsh voice, we hear the word Pharisee, and it's almost synonymous with bad guy. Do not hear that, because that's not how it was understood. The Pharisees were the ones who saw the absence of God, saw the incursion of Rome in their land, thought that Rome's incursion was a punishment for disobedience, and the Pharisees, a lay-led movement, they were going to reintroduce the righteousness of God's law so that God could see the righteousness of their deeds and would return and bless their nation. That's what the Pharisees were setting out to do. They were seeking to purify themselves in a way that appealed and wooed God back into their midst. But in the religious practices, sometimes they lost their way. And it became about the practice and not about the heart. Such was the case with the ritual of washing their hands. Now, I'll be honest with you, studying for it, I couldn't get past the fact that Jesus didn't wash his hands. I was having troubles. I was like, Jesus, that's gross. It's gross. Of course, at that time, germs and stuff were not the issue, or it was, but most of the people did not know that. And so it wasn't about cleanliness. Even though my head said, I know it's not about cleanliness, it's about ritual purity, there was a part of me that was not getting that. And so I had to change the analogy for me to understand it. So imagine, let me change it for you as well. Imagine you are invited to the home of a saint of the church. Let's say Nick Eady, Saint Nick. I worked all week on that, so I deserve more than a groan. But let's say I'm invited to Nick's house for dinner, right? There's this expectation. We're going to come in, the food's going to be set out, and there's this expectation going into a Christian home where we're not quite sure who's going to pray, but someone's going to pray. So imagine I go to Nick's house, and the food's out, and everyone's kind of milling around. You know, we're all kind of looking at Nick, like, who's going to take the lead? I'm silently praying, oh, God, don't tell him to make us hold hands, and, you know, and because someone didn't wash their hands, you know, and all this stuff. I'm going to get stuck next to Jesus, and he didn't wash his hands, and, you know, all this stuff. So we're going through all this. Now imagine I go into that setting, we're all waiting, and just without even being aware of it, I sit down. I'm the preacher. I ought to know better, but I just sit down and start eating. No one prayed. You're like, well, Nick's like, well, you got to pray. We got to pray. That's what we do. We pray. We pray. We pray before we eat. And I'm like, well, where does it say that in the Bible? Well, it doesn't. Not specifically about a meal prayer. Well, where did that come in? Wherever it came in is the same way that hand washing came in for the Jews. It was a ritual practice of purification. It has that same kind of value. There was no law. It's just what they did. And so they were aghast when Jesus just sat down and started eating. Like, you're Jesus. You should know better. And so they sit down, they're starting eating, and the Pharisee is kind of overcome with this, and Jesus, I know he didn't overreact. I mean, he's Jesus, but wow, it is a very strong response. He says, why didn't you wash? And he's like, you Pharisees, you're just concerned about the outside being clean. All the while, you've got stuff going on the inside that no one can see. You're just concerned about the ritual. Oh, God, bless this meal and the hands that prepared it. Like, what does that mean? My wife cooks 99% of the meals in our home, and let me tell you, I want more than her hands blessed. Right? What does that even mean? And let it nourish our bodies for the furtherance of your kingdom. Like, really? I heard that prayer forever. I'm still not sure what that means. And neither do half of us in this room, let's be honest. Sometimes we do these things as just a ritual. And part of what he's saying is we tend to lose ourselves. Here he's the guest. We tend to lose ourselves in the what, forgetting the why all the way along. So he begins to point this out. And here's the first thing he does to point this out is, there it is. He says that the first thing we need to know in this is that the work of God is an inside job. It's a work from the inside out, not the outside in. You do not wash the outside in order to wash the inside. Instead, you wash the inside in order to wash the outside. I tried that this week. My wife was kind enough to go. I had a craving for saltine crackers, blue cheese, and capers. Doesn't that sound amazing? Oh, it was glorious. And so she was kind enough to go and do this, and I got my own little tub of blue cheese. And I'm not supposed to be eating salt, but I was like, forget it. They're going to go in and fix stuff. We might as well take this car out for a ride. And so I sat there and I ate a full sleeve of saltines along with crumbles of blue cheese and capers, and everything kept rolling off my cracker, and I'm still picking crumbles of blue cheese out of the crack in my chair. And so the container was empty, except for some crumbles in there. And so I just to see if this principle works, I put the lid back on. I took it up to the sink and I started cleaning the outside of this container. It had a snap-on lid, and didn't clean the inside, just cleaned the outside. And then I took that container, that clean container on the outside, and I set it on top of the refrigerator. Did you know how blue cheese is cultured? It's mold. So I figured it had a head start. So I stuck it on top of the refrigerator, kind of warm up there, and I come back to it. Guess what I found? The outside was still spick and span. The inside, not so much. It was bluer cheese. I think I could market that. There's blue cheese, then there's Jewett bluer cheese. Here's the reality: is you can't change your life by just washing the outside of it. There's no amount of cleaning up that's going to make what's going on the inside right. There's no amount of dressing up that's going to impress God. There's no amount of it. Understand, Jesus was not talking to the world. He was talking to the Pharisees. He was talking to the lay-led movement of righteousness. And as I was thinking about this, I remembered a quote from C.S. Lewis in his consummate book, Mere Christianity. Here's what he writes. He says, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what He is doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those things needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently, He starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is He up to, you think? The explanation is that He is building a quite different house from the one you thought of. He's throwing out a new wing here. He's putting on an extra floor there. He's running up towers. He's making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but all along He was building a palace. And He intends to come and live in it Himself. This is the work of God. It's an inside work, and it's devastating. It's devastating to everything that we think. But it's devastating because God is doing so much more. And if you want to worry about the outside, you need to deal with the inside. This is what he's saying. It's a hard work. And the only one that can do it is Christ himself. You've tried. Jeremiah had it right. The heart is deceitful and wicked above all things. He had it right. You've tried to do it. It doesn't work. This is where God's renovation comes in this. I'm reminded of what the Revelator writes by the inspiration of the Spirit to the churches in Revelation chapter 2 through 3. He says, so be earnest. He's writing to the churches. So be earnest and change your hearts and lives. Look, this is Jesus speaking now. Look, I'm standing at the door and knocking. If any hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and be with them. I will have dinner with them, and they will have dinner with me. As for those who emerge victorious, I will allow them to sit with me on my throne, just as I emerged victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. You see, part of this principle is that we've lost track of who actually needs saved. In every instance, whether we were reading Jesus' words in the Revelation or Paul's words in Galatians or wherever we read, in these instances that we've talked about, God is speaking to the church. Salvation begins in the church. And it's not by our righteous works. Salvation begins on the inside out. And here's the question: how many of us have lost our way by external righteousness? You're like, Pastor, are you saying don't do good things? No, I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm telling you to be a good person. I don't know how to do that. I don't either. I know someone who does. One last story, we'll go on to the next point. I've learned something about myself through the testimony of other people. I've learned when I'm under anesthesia, I am a horrible human being. I did not know that, right? But I'm not. It's not just that I say bad things. I'm a bad person. Like nurses cry, in-laws are insulted. And it's why we keep a 50-yard cordon around my room when I go in, because I would lose my job if you came to visit me. Some of you are like, we totally need to go visit Jeff. You've been waiting for an excuse, and here you go. But here's what I've learned about instances like that is, and this is hard for me to say, but what is on the inside comes out. When the squeeze is on, what is on the inside comes out. And that's frightening, isn't it? Who are you when life puts pressure on? Because that's who you are on the inside. You're like, where do I start with this project? Number one, it's not your work. Number two, it's God's work. Number three, you start with what does your life look like when it hurts the most? And that's precisely where God's wanting to work with you. Here's the second thing. It's an inside job, but it has an outside consequence. We read these passages, but I want you to hear it again from verses 42. He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every other herb, but you neglect justice and the love of God. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogue and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." So that last verse, let's talk about ritual impurity, like the hand washing. I did not know this until later in the week. But the parallel passage in Matthew talks about whitewashed tombs. Okay, this talks about unmarked grave. But here's what I discovered. If you read Leviticus, you might, rather than read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, just read Leviticus. And if you read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, what you'll find out is that if you come in contact, as a Jew, if you come in contact with a grave, you will become ritually unclean. You cannot participate in temple practices, your sacrifices are not worthy. You have to separate yourself from the congregation. You become ritually unclean for a period of time. So, in order to prevent that from happening, remember Jesus is talking about purity, washing the hands and cleaning up the outside. So what they would do is, so that you didn't accidentally stumble along a grave, because they weren't as neatly organized as our graves are today. It's like, hey, there's a cave. Jed's looking horrible. Let's just camp here for a bit. And maybe he'll bite it and we can stick him in there. There's a grave. And so rather than accidentally coming in contact with the grave, what they would do is they would whitewash them so that you didn't accidentally make yourself unclean. In Matthew's rendering of this story, Jesus kind of gives them the benefit of the doubt. He's saying, at least you're advertising that you're a schmuck. At least you're letting them know. It's like the brightly colored frog that tells the bird, don't eat me, you'll die. Right? It's that idea, a whitewashed tomb. And sometimes people are kind enough to let us know that they are to be avoided. I'm going to smile while I read this because it's going to get me in trouble. It's those who recognize, or it's those who proclaim that they are to be avoided. They are the whitewashed tombs. It's like the false religion of the Westboro Baptist group or the overt misogyny and chauvinism of John MacArthur. At least they have the decency to let us know that they promote and produce death. Whitewashed tomb. Be careful, don't touch. Because the dead kill. Death is contagious. And so he says to these Pharisees, he's not as kind. He does not call them whitewashed tombs. He calls them unmarked graves. It's so much worse. Like your life, you're living your life like a zombie. You're in a state of undead. You're a tomb on display, but you're a tomb on parade. And you're going around, and people that come in contact with you, they don't even know that you're dead, and you're spreading your death. This is what Jesus is saying. Welcome to my home, Jesus. You're dead on the inside and the outside. And so this is what he's saying. It's such an insult to them. But I wonder about the fruit of our life, because while death begets death, life also begets life. See, there's two types of tombs. There's tombs with bodies and tombs without bodies. But they're still tombs. Tombs with bodies are all of them in history except for one. One is one tomb with no body, and that's the tomb of Christ. You see, it's not the question of which tomb do you encounter, or it's not the question of tombs that you encounter, because in a sense, we're all living in a state of death. But it's which tomb. Which tomb do you encounter? Because one produces life and one produces death. And it's only the tomb of Christ that produces life. This is what he's saying. So I have to ask the rhetorical question, is what kind of fruit does your life bear? Is it fruit of life or is it fruit of death? And this is what he's saying. He says, look around you, folks. Everywhere you go is death. I've had to really question myself on some of this week. I heard hard words for me this week. Necessary words this week. Words that express that some of the way I present myself seems like a show, like it's duplicitous, like I don't believe what I'm preaching. And wow, that hurts. But it's necessary for me to hear that, because what kind of fruit do we produce? And it doesn't matter what I say or think or do. It's how is it heard? How is it perceived? That's what matters. And I need to adjust my life in a way that produces fruit that leads to life. This is part of what Christ did. He adjusts our life along the way. And then finally this, he speaks to the lawyers. And he tells them that they're giving burdens without being a blessing. It is not our job to decide who is in and who is out. This is what the lawyers were doing. They were heaping up a bunch of regulations, a bunch of laws. And they were making the determination. It's not our job to decide who is in and who is out. We do not define the other. Instead, we are defined by Christ. Christ who went as a guest to the other. This needs to shape who we are. It is not our job to decide who is in and who is out. When Jesus enters as guest in our life, there is not one thing that is left untouched. This is why the lawyers turned around and said, hey, you're insulting the Pharisees, but this insults us too. This is why Jesus comes into our life. You're like, Jesus, I gave you permission to work in this part of my life. Why are you messing over here? Because Jesus comes in and works on everything. Whether you like it or not. You're like, well, I'm not sure this is such a good thing. Oh, is Jesus a good thing? We're like, yeah, he's a good thing. Well, just so you know, if he comes into your life, he's going to mess with everything. Everything. And if he's not messing with everything, he probably hasn't come into your life. Or you've shut him out. He messes with everything. It doesn't matter if you're a Pharisee, a lawyer. It doesn't matter who you are, what you do. He messes with everything. He says to these lawyers that you have given more burdens without lifting a finger to help carry the load. You pile on requisites but never participate in helping to carry the load. You have so individualized our salvation that we can say, this is what you need to do without ever sharing and carrying the load. We do this in our churches. Come and get saved, then I'm going to tell you all the things you need to do. I'm going to put this on you. 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 Now go home and you'll do fine. No. You see, doing this is a way of destroying community. Where we pile on burdens, we carry the load. Where there is a heavy weight, we come alongside each other in community. This is why Paul says, brothers and sisters, Galatians chapter 6, if a person is caught doing something wrong, you who are spiritual should restore someone like this with a spirit of gentleness. Watch out for yourselves so you also won't be tempted. Instead, carry each other's burdens. Carry each other's burdens. So you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they're important when they aren't, they're fooling themselves. Each person should test their own work and be happy with doing a good job and not compare themselves to others. Each person will have to carry their own load. Now you're like, wait a second. He said, carry each other's loads, and then he says, but each person has to carry their own load. It's this idea that you don't get the ability just to have everyone else carry the burden if you're not participating in it yourself. If you will put on a load, you must carry a load. And if you'll put it on and you're spiritually mature, you must carry a heavier load. Did you know? The mature carry a heavier load than the immature. This is how this works in weightlifting, I've heard. Right? You don't start off benching 400 pounds. Who snickered? That was my wife. You don't start off benching 400 pounds. You start off with the bar. That's me, 45. Right? And that's me with the bar. But you do that a few times, you get a heavier load. You get a heavier load. You get a heavier load. Right? It is the implication that the ones carrying the heavy loads are the spiritually mature. Yet so often in the church, we've done that exactly opposite. We've taken our heavy loads and we've piled them on the immature, and we've not allowed them to grow up to become mature. This is part of what he's talking about. He says, and in so doing, look at the consequences. In so doing, you are actually not only hoarding the key to life for yourself, you're actually preventing others from getting in there because the burden crushes them. Crushes them. So Jesus comes in the ministry of the cross, and he takes that load, and he allows it to crush him. That's what he did. All of the things that we had piled on, we piled on him, and he took upon himself, and it crushed him. And it killed him. Here's the amazing thing is when it killed him, all of the things that were piled on that cross with him died with him. And when he raised, all of the things that were piled on were not raised. They stayed in the grave. This is our victory in Christ. This is the victory that begins on the inside. This is the victory that has consequence on the outside. This is the victory that produces life. This is the victory and the hope that we live in right now. You see, this is the reality. And this is the participation that we have in the body of Christ. And here's what I want you to know. As we go as guests, even when we go as guests to the table of those outside the church, as the guest of the world, the Eucharistic character, the communion characteristic of the mission of God. That's what we do. Every time we eat of this meal, what we are saying is what Jesus did for us, becoming the body and the blood and being broken, we are now going into the world, and we are going to be broken for the world in the same way. We're going to participate in this. So what happens is when we share in this meal that sustains us when we go into the world, even when we sit as a guest at the table of the world, the Eucharistic characterization of the mission of God changes. It transubstantiates the secular into the sacred. So that even where we sit, even when we come as a guest at the table, that the chair that we pull up becomes a place of sacred encounter. This is what Jesus did. So this call, you're like, well, we need a call to salvation. Well, sure we do. We need that all the time, every week, every minute of the day. But understand, Jesus was talking to Pharisees and Sadducees. Today I'm talking to the church. And we need a call. We need a call. But the response of it is what God does on the inside out.